What if the only thing standing between 1,000 women and extinction was a wet, shoeless construction worker from Portland? Not a warrior, not a king, just a man who knew how to read a cracked beam. The sky was green. Not blue. Not gray. Green, like light filtered through the bottom of a glass bottle. Dan Karen's first thought was that his brain had finally given out. His second thought arrived with the cold tip of a spear pressing against his throat. 3 women stood over him, tall and bronze-skinned, wrapped in leather armor, eyes hard as quarry stone. The one in front had copper-red hair knotted tight at the back of her skull. White scars branched across her shoulder like the roots of a tree torn from the earth. She said something sharp and clit, a language that sounded like Greek filtered through gravel. Dan didn't understand a single word. He raised both hands slowly, palms up, the universal sign for I am not a threat. I am just a very confused wet man. The other two circled him, touching the orange fabric of his construction jacket with wary fingers. They had never felt synthetic material before. That detail, more than the spear, more than the green sky, told Dan everything he needed to know. He was not anywhere close to home. His lungs still burned with salt water. He remembered the ferry, the storm, the deck tilting at a sickening angle. He remembered the family trapped in the cabin below. A mother, 2 children. A man with a broken arm. He remembered pulling them toward the lifeboats. He remembered the water closing over his head like a fist. After that, nothing, until the sand and the spear and the impossible green sky. Dan thought he might be dead. Then the spear tip nicked his chin and he decided the dead probably didn't bleed. That was when the strangest thing happened. And on a morning that had already broken every rule of strangeness, that was saying something. A golden tablet appeared in the air above the redhead's right shoulder. It floated there, glowing with warm amber light, solid as wood but casting no shadow. The letters on it were English, clear and crisp. Dan read them once, twice, 3 times, just to be absolutely certain. Chief Architect, task, build a city for 1,000 women in 1,000 days. Failure means the island's doom. He closed his eyes. He opened them. The tablet was still there. So was the spear. Dan looked past the redhead toward the hill rising behind the beach. And his eyes found the problem before his brain even finished processing the scene. A hut sat on the hill. Wood, palm leaves, basic construction. And the load-bearing beam on its left side had cracked diagonally. Fatigue fracture from uneven load distribution. The left corner foundation had settled, stone stacked without mortar already pulling apart. That hut would collapse in a week. Dan opened his mouth, his voice raw from salt water, and wheezed at the woman with the spear that the beam over there was about to go. The redhead blinked. She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone, urgent, professional, certain, made her lower the spear by half an inch. Half an inch was enough. Dan sat up. The world spun like the deck of the ferry in the storm. He dug his palm into the hot sand and forced himself not to vomit. He looked around properly for the first time. Cliffs, palm trees, a western slope covered in huts, 100 of them, maybe more. All with sagging roofs and walls that leaned at angles no wall should lean. Figures moved between the huts, all women, every single one, not a man in sight. He looked at the golden tablet again. 1,000 female residents. He looked at the crooked walls, the non-existent foundations, the roofs that were one heavy rain away from becoming rubble. One simple thought formed in the center of his exhausted mind. Whoever wrote this assignment knew exactly what they would be dealing with. The redhead demanded something louder. Dan pointed at the hut on the hill. He ran the edge of his palm diagonally through the air, a crack, then spread his arms wide and let them drop. A fall. The redhead frowned. She looked at the hut. One of the other women said something quickly and the redhead cut her off with a single hard word. Then she jabbed the blunt end of the spear into his back. Walk. Some commands need no translation. They led him up the beach path, sand burning his bare feet. He had lost his shoe somewhere in the ocean. Dan stumbled twice. The third time, one of the women grabbed him by the collar and hauled him upright with one hand. The way you'd lift a small dog. He understood something important in that moment. These women were stronger than him. Much, much stronger. The path led directly toward the hut with the cracked beam, and Dan stopped cold. The redhead shoved him forward. He didn't move. He walked to the wall instead, pressed his fingers into the crack, 2 fingers wide, the wood soft with rot, and knocked his knuckle against the beam. A dull thud, rotten wood. He knocked the beam beside it. A sharp ring, healthy wood. Back to the damaged one. Dull thud again. The redhead came closer and listened. Something changed in her eyes. Not trust, nowhere near trust, but a flicker of genuine interest. She shouted up the slope, and women came. 5, 10, 20, forming a semicircle around Dan like a cautious audience, a very strange performance. Most watched with curiosity. Some watched with disgust. One woman with black hair and tattoos across her cheekbones stared with a hatred so physical he could feel it pressing against his skin. An argument broke out. He knew the shape of it without understanding the words. He had worked 10 years on construction sites and had seen this exact argument 100 times. One side saying they needed to sort it out, the other saying they needed to get rid of it. Then a quiet voice cut through everything and every woman went still. An old woman descended from the upper hut, small, gray hair falling to her waist, eyes pale and sharp as to finishing nails. Even the black-haired woman with the tattoos took a step back. The elder approached Dan and touched his forehead with cold fingers, closed her eyes, murmured something low and deliberate. When she opened her eyes again she spoke one short, heavy word. The redhead's jaw dropped. The black-haired woman went pale. The golden tablet above Dawn's head flashed once, like a confirmation stamp upon a work order. Dan stood barefoot on the hot earth, soaking wet, surrounded by 30 armed women who could break him in two. He thought about the sagging roofs, the unmortared foundations, the murky well, the children with swollen bellies he had spotted near the lower huts. He thought about the task. 1,000 days, 1,000 women, one city from nothing. And he thought, all right, you always start with the foundation. They locked him in a goat pen on the edge of the settlement. 3 goats and a smell, to cross spears at the entrance. Dan sat in the straw, held out his hand toward the golden tablet, and watched his fingers pass right through it, light, not solid, but the letters were perfectly legible. 1,000 days. He counted it out. 2 years and 9 months, roughly, to build a city from scratch with no machinery, no concrete, no steel, no electricity, and a population that didn't understand a word he said. A goat rested its head on his knee. He scratched it behind the ear and started mentally drafting the site inspection report. He had rebuilt homes after a hurricane in Louisiana. He had spent 3 years repairing Korean hammocks using materials 3 centuries old. He had managed a residential complex in Portland with a crew of 20 speaking 4 languages, all of whom despised each other. This was just another construction project, the strangest one of his life, but a construction project. And every construction project began the same way. Site inspection, material assessment, list of problems. Palm leaf roofs laid flat instead of layered. That was why they leaked. Foundations without mortar. That was why they shifted. Logs set directly into the ground without treatment. That was why they rotted from the bottom up. And there was an open well in the center of the settlement, the water murky, directly downhill from a waste ditch. That explained the children with swollen bellies. Dan told the goat that the first thing they needed to sort out was the water. The goat blinked slowly. He took that as agreement. Night fell fast, the green sky deepening to black, the stars completely foreign. Not a single constellation he recognized. This was not his world. But it was his worksite now. On the morning of the second day, Dan got his first small victory through gestures alone. He showed a guard the black silt coating a rag he had lowered to the bottom of the central well, then traced with his hand the path of water flowing downhill from the waste ditch straight into the drinking source. The younger guard went pale. She was not an engineer, but she had seen sick children, and now she was beginning to understand why. She walked briskly up the slope and came back with the redhead. Dan still didn't know her name, but he recognized her by the copper hair and the branch-white scars. Inside the elder's large hut, dark and thick with hearth smoke, Dan noted immediately, there was no chimney, no ventilation. He crouched on the dirt floor and drew with a charred stick. A hill, a waste ditch at the top, wavy lines running down, a circle at the bottom for the well, and a straight line connecting ditch to well. He pointed to the black rag. He pointed to the line. He gestured at his stomach and mind pain. He pointed toward where a labored cough echoed from the far corner of the hut. The old woman, Yolanta, though he didn't know her name yet, leaned over the drawing for a long time. The woman with shoulders like blacksmith's bellows said something sharp and skeptical. The thin one shook her head. The black-haired woman by the wall snorted. Dan paid none of them any attention. He watched only Yolanta, because she was the only one truly thinking rather than reacting. She extended one finger and touched the line running from the ditch to the well. Then she covered her face with both hands. She had understood. The silence in the hut became something heavy, something with weight. When Yolanta lowered her hands, her eyes were wet. she said to quiet words that made every woman in the room go still. Then she looked at Den and made a gesture that needed no translation. "Show me what to do." He drew again. A new well, higher up the eastern slope, far from any ditch. Walls lined with fired clay, a stone lid, a drainage channel carrying overflow safely away. He pointed to clay, then mimed fire. The clay had to be fired first, then lay. Yolanta nodded and turned to the broad-shouldered woman with one long sentence. And that woman stood up and walked out, and her commanding voice could be heard through the wall, like a bell. The next morning, 30 women with wooden shovels and stone tips were waiting on the eastern slope. Den marked the site, picked up a shovel, and started digging. The clay was heavy. After 20 minutes his hands burned. After 40 he was drenched through. 30 women stood in a ring and watched, some curious, some openly mocking, because he was weaker than every single one of them, and everyone could see it clearly. Den did not stop. He knew that the first few days were never about results on a new site. They were about making a point. A foreman who stands on the side and points stays an outsider forever. A foreman who digs alongside the crew, even slower, even worse, becomes part of the work. An hour in, one young broad-shouldered woman with short dark hair could not watch anymore. She took the shovel from his hands, not roughly, almost politely, and drove it into the earth. 3 strokes from her covered what he had done in 10 minutes. She was as strong as an excavator. Den stepped back and began directing. Deeper. Straighter. Keep the walls vertical. A second woman picked up another shovel. A third. By evening the pit was 1.5 times a person's height. The walls even. The bottom solid clean clay. The redhead, Kasa, he would learn soon, stood at the edge and looked down. Then handed him a flask of water. Not kindness, not friendship. An acknowledgement that he was doing something necessary. For Den, it was the most important thing anyone had done for him since he washed ashore. Firing the clay took a full day. A long, narrow fire with stones on the sides to hold the heat. Thin even slabs cut from the pit walls, each one the size of a palm. He knew from experience that thick slabs crack during firing. Thin ones hold. By evening he had 20 fired clay tiles, hard and ringing, waterproof when he poured water across them. Yolanta took one in her hands, turned it, bit it, then smiled for the first time. Small, real, and it cracked something open in Don's chest that he hadn't felt since before the ocean. On the 4th day, the new well was finished. Clay-lined walls, mortar of raw clay and ash packed between the tiles, a weighted wooden lid, a drainage gutter carrying an overflow down the slope away from the settlement. Yolanta tasted the first water. She cupped it in her palm, brought it to her face, sniffed, drank slowly, closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears running down her face. She lowered herself to the ground and pressed her forehead to the packed clay, a bow so deep and total that Den lunged forward and grabbed her shoulders. He fumbled in English that she shouldn't, that it was just hydrology, that he had moved the well 200 paces. She didn't understand the words, but she understood his tone, and the tears didn't stop. For him it was 3 days of work. For her it was a generation of children who would live. A young mother stepped up with a baby on her hip, drew water, held it to the child's mouth. The child drank greedily. The mother looked at Dan, not smiling, not bowing, just looking, with something in her gaze that made his throat close completely. Kasa stood to the side, with her arms crossed and her face unreadable, but she had been there all for days. She hadn't left once. That evening, back in the goat pen, Dan found a thick hide to sleep on, a bowl of porridge with dried fish, and a small clay pot of honey, dark and sweet-smelling, left by the wall. He didn't know who left it. The guard was looking carefully in the opposite direction. He dipped a finger, tasted it, and sat in the straw eating honey and building tomorrow's schedule. In his head, the rain was coming. He could feel it in the wine, see it in the cloud shapes, read it in the way the goats pressed close to the walls. Heavy rain in a week. Half these roofs would not hold. 996 days remaining. On the 5th morning, a woman he had never seen appeared in the doorway of the pen. Small, pale, with straight dark hair to her shoulders and large slightly tilted eyes. She looked nothing like the tall bronze women of the settlement. She held out a clay cup with something hot steaming from the top. Den took it and drank. Then he dropped it, because she had just said good morning in Korean, his grandmother's language, the language of the village in Gangwon-do, where he had spent 3 years repairing old hammocks. He stared at her. He said, in Korean, that she spoke Korean. An obvious thing to say, The only thing his stunned brain could form. The woman flinched, stepped back, stepped forward, and then her face broke open between laughing and crying. Her name was Lena. Her mother had come from the sea long ago, and her mother had spoken this language. And her mother had died when Lena was small, and Lena had kept the words alive inside herself with no one to say them to. For the first time in 5 days on this island, someone understood his words. Den sat back down on the hide and gestured to the space beside him. She sat like a bird on a ledge, ready to fly at the first strong move. He asked about the island. She told him slowly, choosing words, checking his face, that the island was called Telissa, that the women here had lived for 1,000 years, that there were no men, had not been any for a long time, that men who washed ashore were called the worthy. A word she whispered like it was made of something fragile. Den asked what happened to the worthy. Lena blushed and looked away and said they were needed to continue the line, that afterward they left or stay. It varied. He decided not to push that particular threat. He asked about the golden tablet and she told him that everyone saw it. Everyone knew what it meant. Something ancient connected to the temple on the hilltop. A system the priestesses had kept secret for generations. She told him the tablet had appeared before, above other worthy ones. He asked how many. She counted on her fingers. 5. Maybe 6. Over 1,000 years. 5 or 6 men over 1,000 years. And that explained everything about the way they looked at him. To some, a miracle. To some, a threat. To some, something entirely more dangerous. He asked about the black-haired woman with the tattoos. Lena's expression darkened. That was Nika Sulto, the island's finest warrior, leader of those who called themselves the pure. They believed the island must live without men, that every worthy was a trial, not a gift, that men brought only weakness. Na's mother had believed the worthy would come and save them. Na's mother had waited her whole life. Na's mother had died waiting. Dan nodded. He didn't agree, but he understood. He asked if Lena would be his translator. She went quiet for a long time. She said she was a nobody, that the others saw her as an outsider, that her mother was from the mainland, that if she walked beside him it would raise questions. Dan looked at this 19-year-old girl who had been made invisible her entire life and told her that her language was the most valuable tool on this island right now. More valuable than any axe. More valuable than any spear. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Small, but firm. From that day on, she became his shadow. And almost immediately, Dan discovered that Lena was not just a translator. She was sharp. When he explained the principle of a drainage gutter, she grasped it in seconds. When he drew a sloped roof design, she immediately asked why not the other direction. And she was right. The slope needed to face away from the path or the rainwater would wash out the road below. She thought like a builder who had simply never been handed the tools. On the 6th day, Dan started on the roofs with one eye on the western horizon where thick low clouds were already rolling in. 2 days, maybe 3, before the rain hit. He gathered women, gathered palm leaves, and showed them the difference between laying leaves flat, which was what they did, which was why water poured through, and laying them in overlapping layers like scales, each new row covering the joint of the row below. Simple, but they had not known. For 1,000 years, the rain had come in. He repaired Yolanta's hut first. That was not an accident. And the elder came outside and touched the edge of the new roof slowly. The way you touch something you can hardly believe is real. She asked through Lena how he knew these things. Den said that where he came from, everyone built this way. Yolanta shook her head and said, not everyone. Only those who think. By evening of the 6th day, 3 roofs were repaired. By the 7th, 5 more. By the morning of the 8th, 10 women were working without his constant supervision. And on the 8th day, the rain arrived. It hit like a fist. Heavy, furious, the walls shaking in the wind. But inside the repaired huts, the ceilings were dry. Not a single drop. From the huts with old roofs came screams, cursing, the desperate sound of bowls being placed to catch the leaks. Den stepped into the rain. He climbed onto the nearest leaking roof and began tearing off the old shingles, laying new ones by hand in the downpour, water lashing his face. Kasa appeared below. She shouted up that he was an idiot and that he would fall. He kept laying leaves. 20 minutes later the roof held. He climbed down and stood in the mud, soaking, shivering. Kasa stood in front of him, just as wet. She looked at him, looked at the roof, looked back at him. Then she said one word. Fool, but the tone was different. Not angry, almost warm. She grabbed him by the collar, dragged him back to the pen, threw him a dry high, and told Lena that if he died of a cold, she would personally throw his body back into the sea, and that this was not a joke. 10 minutes later the guard brought hot broth and meat. Real meat, not fish. And Lena sat beside him in the pen, both of them soaked, eating in the dry silence of the roof Dan had thatched first. That night he drew drainage ditches on the ground while Lena watched. Channels along the main paths, not deep, knee-deep, stone-bottomed, carrying rainwater down the slope away from the settlement instead of through it. Lena listened, then asked if they could direct the water not to the sea, but to one place, a basin, to collect it. Dan stopped chewing. A 19-year-old potter who had never studied engineering had just independently invented a rainwater collection basin. He told her it was a great idea. She lowered her head, but he caught the corners of her lips turning up. It was probably the first compliment she had received in a very long time. On the 9th day after the rain stopped, 2 huts had collapsed, old beams, rotten to dust inside, while looking solid on the outside. Dan examined the rubble and through Lena explained the simple fix that no one on this island had used in 1,000 years of building. Every beam must rest on a stone, not sit in the ground. Stone does not rot. Stone does not wick moisture. For 1,000 years, they had set logs directly into the earth. For 1,000 years the logs had rotted. For 1,000 years, they had been rebuilding. By the 10th day, Dan had repaired 12 roofs, dug 3 drainage ditches, fixed foundations in 2 huts, and learned roughly 100 words of the local language. He mangled the guttural sounds mercilessly. The women laughed, not cruelly, just genuinely, because it was funny. He didn't take offense. The Guatemalans on his Portland crew had laughed at his Spanish for a full year. He got through it. He would get through it here. On the 10th day, he was moved out of the goat pen into a small hut of his own. A door, a plank bed, a small stone hearth. He stood in the doorway looking at it and asked Lena whose decision this had been. She smiled and said nothing. On the 11th day, Dan stood in front of Yolanta's hut and tried to explain what a chimney was. The word did not exist in the Telissa language. Smoke simply existed. It escaped through cracks as it always had. He drew it with a stick, a hearth, a stone pipe rising through the roof, smoke traveling up and out into the air outside, clean air inside, heat staying in, cough gone. Yolanta asked through Lena if the roof would collapse if they cut a hole in it. A reasonable question. Dan drew the structure in more detail. Wide stone base narrowing toward the top, the masonry reinforcing the opening rather than weakening it. Yolanta did not fully understand the engineering, but she understood people, and she could see that Dan was certain. She said one word. Do it. He started with flat layered slate from the eastern rock face, stone that split cleanly along its grain, perfect for the work. He mixed mortar himself, clay, ash, water, sand, testing the consistency by squeezing it in his fist until it held its shape without cracking or running. Lena watched, then asked if she could try. He showed her the proportions. 10 minutes later, her mortar was smoother and more consistent than his. She had the hands of a potter who had spent her whole life reading clay through her fingertips. On the 12th day, Dan began laying the chimney. Stone on mortar, mortar on stone, each row slightly smaller than the one before, rising toward the roof. Casa arrived after noon with 4 of her warriors, listened to the explanation through Lena, then said a short word to her women. They set down the straps from their weapons, rolled up their sleeves, and joined the work. No sentiment, no ceremony. They just picked up stones and passed them into his hands one by one. Their grip like vices, their pace steady and enormous. By evening of the 12th day, the chimney stood from hearth to roof and beyond. Dan lit the fire. Everyone watched. Smoke rose, curled, stretched toward the pipe, and a gray column appeared from the top of the chimney out above the roofline, rising into the green evening sky and dissipating cleanly. Inside the hut, nothing. No smoke, just warmth, radiating from the stone of the pipe pinned to the air of the room. Yolanta stood in the center of her hut and breathed in, deeply. Again, she was not coughing. For the first time in decades, there was no smoke in her home. She lay down on her bed and said quietly that it was warm and she could breathe, and that she did not remember the last time that had happened. Dan stood at the entrance and watched, and his throat wouldn't work properly. Casa stood shoulder to shoulder with him, not looking at him, looking at Yolanta. Then she said one quiet word. Dan already knew it. Okay. She walked off into the dark. The next morning, 12 women stood in a line outside Don's hut before he had finished breakfast. They all wanted a chimney. He looked at that line and thought 12 chimneys. I himself would take 12 days at minimum, plus stone gathering, plus mortar mixing, plus the unexpected. He needed a crew. He picked 5, not the strongest, to most attentive, the ones who had watched him lay the stones and had remembered. Among them was the young broad-shouldered woman who had taken his shovel on the first day of well digging. Her name was Mororo. Hands like a bear's paws, but eyes that were sharp and focused and caught everything. She got it right on the first try. Croaked, but right in principle. He corrected her. Stone slightly left, mortar thinner. Next row offset so no joint sits directly above another joint. Second try. Better. Third try. Deader still. By evening, Mororo had built a stone wall that didn't wobble. He almost put his hand on her shoulder, then remembered, pulled it back, apologized with a gesture. Men didn't touch women here. Mororo looked at her wall, then at her mortar-caked hands, then at Dan, and smiled. The first smile directed at him from anyone but Lena. He praised them in public, corrected them in private. An old rule from every construction site he had ever worked. People need pride. Without pride they stop trying. By the 25th day, his 5 students were installing chimneys without him standing over them. He checked each one, fixed small details, but the work was theirs. And with every new chimney, something shifted in the settlement that had nothing to do with engineering. Women started looking forward to evening. Before, evening had meant cold and smoke in the eyes. Now it meant warmth and clean air and a reason to stay inside. Women sat by their hearths longer, talked later, arranged their huts, hung skins neatly on the walls. When a house stops being just a shelter and becomes a warm place people love, Den had learned. They want it to be beautiful. It worked the same way in Portland as it worked on Telissa. On the 20th day, Na came to the construction site where Mororo's crew was laying another chimney. She stood and watched in silence. Then she spoke loudly, so everyone heard, and Lena translated without blinking. Na said that Dan was corrupting the island's women, making them soft, teaching them to think of warmth instead of strength, that warriors did not lay stones, that this was slave labor. Mororo straightened up from her work, a stone still in her hand, and said something brief. Lena translated with wide eyes. Mororo had told Na that if she thought it was that easy, she was welcome to build a better wall herself. Silence dropped over the site, like a stone falling into water. Na went pale, then red, then she turned and walked away. But in the last second, Den caught her gaze flicking to the wall behind Mororo. The even stonework, the chimney rising clean above the roofline, the smoke hurling into the sky, instead of suffocating the people below. There was no hatred in his eyes in that moment. There was a question. Den filed that away. Na would not be moved by logic or evidence or persuasion. She would break only when she saw the result, when she saw that those living in the new houses were better off. It was only a matter of time. By the 30th day, Chimneys stood in 20 huts, and Dan had already moved on to his next problem. Not a hearth, a stove, closed combustion chamber, cooking surface, adjustable draft. A hearth devoured firewood and lost most of its heat to the air. A stove used half the wood and gave off twice the warmth. The difference was like a candle compared to a lamp. He built the first one in Yolanda's hut and cooked soup on it that evening. Grain, root vegetables, dried fish, salt, herbs, nothing unusual, all ingredients they, every day, but cooked on a flat, evenly heated surface in a proper pot at a proper temperature. Yolanda tasted it and asked through Lena what he had put in the water. He listed the ingredients, the same ones they ate every day. Same ingredients, she said. He nodded. Same ingredients, different cooking. She finished her bowl and asked for more. On the evening of the 30th day, Dan sat on the threshold of his hut watching smoke rise from 20 chimneys into the green night sky. Someone had left honey at his doorstep again, a bowl of it, dark and warm. He still didn't know who. He dipped his finger and sat watching the smoke and thinking about tomorrow. 970 days remaining. Casa stepped out of the dark and sat beside him without a word. They watched the chimneys in silence. Then she said something quiet. 5 words, and he understood 2 of them. All right. And home. She got up and left. Dan sat with honey on his fingers and something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. On the 32nd day, Dan baked bread. He had prepared a sourdough starter 3 days before. Flour and water in a clay pot kept warm near the stove, covered with cloth, left to ferment. He mixed it into coarse dark flour before dawn, kneaded it by hand, let it rise in the warmth, then placed the dough on the hot cooking stone and covered it with an upturned clay pot. An improvised oven. Heat from all sides. 40 minutes later the bread was done. Dark crust, soft center, air bubbles throughout, porous and alive, nothing like the flat stone-baked circles they cooked here. Yolanta woke from the smell. She sat up on her cot, looked at Den holding the loaf, steaming from the broken center, and took the half he held out. She chewed slowly, closed her eyes. When she opened them they were wet. She said she did not know grain could be like this. Den explained that it was the starter, the warmth, the time, the same grain, the same flour. But if you gave the dough time, it came to life. Yolanta ate and cried quietly, and Den looked away. The smell of bread drifted out the door. Within 10 minutes there were 15 women outside. He broke the remaining half of the loaf into finger-sized pieces and handed them out. The women who chewed and tasted looked at him as though he had turned a stone into gold. He hadn't. He had just baked bread. But for a people who ate whole grain porridge because grinding flour by hand took half a day per batch, bread was something close to a miracle. On the 35th day, Den stood in front of a woman grinding grain by hand with a stone, millstone, sweat on her face, calluses stacking on calluses, back bent from a lifetime of this work. He watched her and taught one word, mill. He turned to Lena and described it, wine-catching blades, blades turning a shaft, shaft turning a millstone through a gear system, grain falling in from above, flour pouring out below, no human hands required. Lena's eyes moved across the idea the way her hands moved across clay, feeling for the shape inside it. She asked if it was possible. He said the western slope faced the sea with constant strong wind and that it was perfect. He began designing immediately. It was the most complex project on the island so far. Stone foundation 6 paces across, a single straight hardwood trunk for the shaft, wooden gears with teeth that had to be cut by hand to precise and identical dimensions. Den carved the gear teeth himself in his hut in the evenings, Weena sitting beside him, teaching him words while he worked. Stone, fire, door, chimney, hot, cold, water, clay. She corrected his guttural sounds and covered her mouth when she laughed. Building the mill took 20 days. Mororo's crew laid the stone base. Experienced now, the mortar dense, the lines even, Den making almost no corrections. On the 40th day, 4 wooden blades covered in plant fiber cloth were hoisted onto the shaft. With a rope and pulley system, 10 women pulling in sequence. The mill stood on the western slope with its arms open to the sea wind, ropes holding it still. Den checked every connection, every wooden tin, every knot. Then he untied the ropes one by one. The wind found the first blade, a jolt, the second blade filled, the third, the fourth, and the mill began to turn with a wooden creak that rose into something steadier. A hum, a rhythm, the sound of a working mechanism. The large gear on the vertical shaft engaged the small gear on the horizontal one. The small gear spun faster. The millstone began to turn. Den poured grain into the hopper. It fell between the stones, and flour, white, fine, poured from the slot at the bottom in a steady stream. 50 women or more stood watching the blades spin on their own, the flour appearing from nothing, the wine doing the work that had broken their hands for 1,000 years. The woman who had spent her life the hand stone stove in the front row and looked at the flour, and then at her ruined hands and then at the flour again, and she dropped to her knees. Not before Dan, before the mill. He lifted her up gently and told her in his broken Telissa that it was not a god. It was the wind, just the wind. She didn't quite believe him, but she stood. Kasao stood to the side, arms crossed, face unreadable, and when Dan turned, he caught the corner of her mouth pulled up for one unguarded second before her face went stone again. He pretended he hadn't seen it. In its first week, the mill ground as much flour as 10 women could produce in a month. Bread became daily, not a feast, a meal. And something else happened that Dan had seen on his best construction sites. The women stopped waiting for instructions and started thinking for themselves. One baker came to him and said through Lena that ground nuts from the southern slope would improve the bread's flavor. She was right. The nuts gave it a warm, aromatic depth. Another woman discovered that thin sliced bread dried in the sun became crackers that lasted for weeks. A third started experimenting with herbs in the dough. When the crew stops waiting and starts innovating, the system is working. On the 52nd day, Na stood alone in front of the mill and watched the blades turning. Dan saw her from his cabin window, She didn't know he was watching. She touched the stone wall of the foundation, then bent and cupped a handful of flour from the stream at the base of the millstone, white on her dark palm. She looked at it for a moment. Then she clenched her fist and let it run through her fingers. She walked away with an expressionless face. But her eyes. Dan had seen her eyes. No hatred there. Something else. Something like hunger. On the 55th day, Dan began laying bamboo pipes. Thick hollow stalks, joints sealed with clay and pine resin, carrying water from the new eastern well down the slope along the constant grade to a stone basin in the square in front of the elder's hut. Gravity did everything. No buckets, no trips, no arguments over who waited longest. Clean water in the center of the settlement, always running, always cool. The official opening was not a ceremony. Dan simply opened the valve and water began to gurgle through the bamboo. And women lined the root and listened to it moving inside the hollow cane, inside the plant, on its own. Then it emerged from the end and poured into the stone basin. A girl of about 5 years old approached first. She held her palms out under the stream. The water filled them, cold and clean. She drank. She lifted her wet face and smiled. Then the other children came, crowding the basin, splashing, laughing. Kasa stood next to Dan and watched. Then she said 3 words and he understood all 3. The children don't get sick. He nodded. Yes, clean water, warm homes, food, the most basic things, the simplest things. Absent from this island for 1,000 years. Then Kasa told him something he hadn't known. 7 years ago, her younger sister drowned because the village had no proper dock. Her boat caught on the rocks, and her sister was 12 years old. Kasa had hated the sea ever since. Dan listened without filling the silence. When Kasa finished, she said quietly through Lena that she thought about it every day, that the sea took the only person she loved. Dan stood still for a moment, then he said 4 words in her language, clumsily, but clearly, I will build a pier. Kasa turned and looked at him. Her eyes were red. She was a warrior and she was not crying, but her eyes were red. She nodded once and walked away fast, not looking back. Lena watched her go, then said quietly that Kasa had never told anyone about her sister before. Dan said nothing. He looked at the golden plaque. On the 58th day he stood on the shore and looked at the bay, the black rocks jutting up like broken teeth, the narrow passage 3 boats wide, the angle at which a wave could catch a hull and drive it into the stone. He drew in the wet sand. A breakwater, a line of heavy stone stretching from the shore into the bay at an angle that would catch the waves and break their force before they reached the passage. Beyond the breakwater, calm water, a wooden pier. Boats tied to flat planks instead of dragged across rock. Kasa ran her finger along the line of stones in the sand, then looked up at the bay and saw what he had drawn there in her mind. She said 1 word. When? He held up his fingers. 2 months. Maybe 3. She turned to her 4 warriors and said a short phrase. They removed the straps from their weapons. Show me. The breakwater was not a chimney. Stones had to be dragged into the sea and placed on the seabed layer by layer, each weighing as much as a person or more. Dan built a wide flat raft of logs, load the stones onto the raft, push it to position, drop them. No one standing chest deep in the water with a boulder in their arms. On the 62nd day, Timorin arrived at the breakwater site, the lizard rider, tall, tanned dark by the sun, laughing before she said a word. To monitor lizards the size of large dogs following her like puppies. She looked at the raft, at the stones, at the women hauling boulders, then at Dan, and said through Lena that for a man weaker than a goat, he was very brave. Then she harnessed her lizards to a boulder with a rope harness, gave a short whistle, and the boulder slid across the sand like it weighed nothing. The work doubled in speed. T stayed. Day 1, 2, 3, chattering constantly in a voice that filled the bay and never seemed to need a response. On the 3rd evening, Dan looked at the lizard sleeping on the cold rocks, scales flaking where old scrapes hadn't healed, cold-blooded animals spending nights on stone in the sea air. He told T he would build them a pen with a heated floor. T stopped smiling for the first time in 3 days. She asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. Stone walls, or roof, a channel under the floor with hot air flowing through it. The stones warm all night. T said quietly that no one had ever done anything for her lizards, that everyone called them dirty and told her to be normal, that only the monitor lizards never told her to be someone else. Dan sketched the pen in the sand with a stick. Dimensions, hearth location, the angle of the hot air duct beneath the floor. T looked at the sketch for a long time, then she smiled. Not the loud showy grin she wore like armor, but a small genuine one, the kind that took more courage to show. On the 65th day, Dan began building the bathhouse. He had been waiting for this project more than any other, not because it was the hardest, but because it would change something the other projects hadn't touched. Not shelter, not food, not water, but culture. He had found a hot spring on the northern slope, water flowing from rock at exactly the right temperature, warm without boiling, sulfuric, naturally antiseptic. 400 steps of bamboo pipe, thick stone walls to hold heat, wooden benches inside, a stone floor sloping toward a drain, ventilation under the roof, stone shelves for herbs and oils. Na was summoned to the council meeting, where Dan presented the plan and she stood with her arms crossed and asked why waste time on a washing room when it could be spent on weapons and training. Dan replied through Lena that sick warriors cannot fight, that a clean body is a healthy body, that a healthy body is a strong body. Na stood up and left without a word, just stood and left, and Yolanta watched her go, then turned to Dan and said 2 words. Build it. The bathhouse took from day 65 to day 170, the largest structure on the island. Walls twice the thickness of any hut, laid on mortar. 3 crews of 5 working in shifts, morning through dark, Dan sleeping for hours at a time, eating on the move, Lena waking him when he fell asleep at dinner. On the 91st day, the first serious confrontation, a warrior from this faction refused to carry stones, called it slave work, and struck Mororo across the face. When she objected, Mororo hit the ground, got up, blood running from her nose. She picked up a stone, not to throw, to lay, turned her back to the warrior, and placed it on the wall. Even mortar set, exactly right. The warrior stood with her fist raised at Mororo's back, everyone watching. Mororo didn't turn around. Stone on mortar, mortar on stone, blood dripping onto her hands, wiped on the back of her wrist. The warrior lowered her fist and walked away. That evening Dan sat beside Mororo at the fire and handed her a cold wet cloth for her nose. He said she had been stronger than that warrior today. She shook her head, said if the other woman had struck again, she would have stayed down. Dan said that strength wasn't about withstanding a blow. Strength was picking up a stone after the blow and placing it on the wall. Mororo was silent. Then she nodded. On the 105th day, Na challenged Dan to a duel in the square, spear in hand, 300 women around them. She called him a coward who hid behind women's backs. Dan walked forward and stood in front of her. She was a head taller, broader at the shoulder, muscle beneath her skin like braided rope. She would end him into seconds and they both knew it. Through Lena he said, "Na, you will win into seconds and you will be ashamed." She squinted. He proposed something else instead. A contest. 10 days, to houses, 1 crew each, the elders to judge. Na built however she wished. Dan built as well as he could. Na stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, loud, scornful, and said accepted. Kasa walked beside Dan as the crowd parted and said quietly that she thought he would lose. He said he knew. She looked at him. He smiled. In 10 days, she would understand. Na took her 10 best warriors and began furiously. Trees felled, stones dragged, logs driven into ground. By the 3rd day her frame stood, rough, crooked, but standing. Dan took Mororo and for students and spent the entire first day only on the foundation. Stones on mortar, level, every joint filled, every stone checked. On the 6th day, Na's house was finished. Thick, rough, palm leaf roof, doorway, everything crooked but standing. She looked down at Dawn's walls, still only chest height, and smirked. By the 9th day, a tiled clay roof, courtesy of Lena who had been firing tiles all week specifically for this. On the 10th day, a chimney, a door on leather hinges, a window with a wooden shutter, a stone floor. Yolanta went into Na's house at sunset and lit a fire. Smoke filled the room. Wine whistled through the wall cracks. The dirt floor was cold then damp. She came out coughing. Then she went into Dawn's house and lit the stove. The smoke went up the chimney. The floor was smooth stone. The walls did not move. The heat stayed inside. Yolanta stayed inside for a long time. When she came out, she did not announce a winner. She simply looked at Na, then at Dan. And everyone present understood. Na stood with a face like cut stone, but in the last second before she turned away, Dan saw her eyes move to the chimney, to the tile roof, to the even walls. The same look she had given the mill. Not hatred, not contempt. A question she was not yet ready to ask out loud. On the 170th day, the bathhouse was ready. Den stood at the entrance feeling something he hadn't expected. Nerves, the way you feel before handing a finished building to someone for the first time. Yolanta went in first. He stood outside and heard her cautious steps on the stone floor. Then silence, then the sound of water. She had lowered herself onto a bench, put her feet into the warm flowing stream from the hot spring. Then a long silence, then from inside, quiet and unmistakable, the sound of Yolanta weeping. Not from pain, not from fear. The way people cry when something ends that went on too long. Cold winters, aching lungs, wounds that never fully healed. Others filed in behind her, one by one, two at a time, then in groups. And the laughter gave way to silence, steam rising from the door, the smell of herbs someone had placed on a hot stone drifting out into the afternoon air. Den leaned against the outer wall, which was warm from the steam inside, and looked up at the green sky. A voice beside him said, in clear English with a British accent, he gave them warmth. Did he understand what that meant here? Den had not heard English in 6 months. The sound hit him somewhere under the ribs. He turned to find a tall fair-skinned woman with dark blonde hair and hands scarred from burns. A doctor's hands, watching him with a small tired smile. She said her name was Rebecca Vance, ship's doctor, washed ashore 6 years ago. And that the word she had most wanted to hear in all that time was coffee. Den laughed out loud for the first time in half a year. They stood against the warm stone wall of the bathhouse and laughed like two people who had forgotten they knew how. While inside, 1,000 years of cold slowly left the bones of the women of Telissa. Kasa came out last. Hair loose, no armor, a simple tunic, younger looking, softer at the edges in a way Dan had never seen. She stood before him and said to Rebecca, that in 26 years of living, this was the first time she had ever felt truly warm, and that she had not known warmth could be like this. Then she walked away, and Dan watched her go. And Rebecca put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Kasa, who had held a spear to his throat on the first morning, had just told him the truest thing anyone had said since he washed ashore, and the city he had not yet finished building already felt, in that moment, like home. He had arrived with salt water in his lungs and nothing but 30 years on construction sites, and what he built out of stone, and clay and stubbornness, and the work of 1,000 women's hands, would stand long after the green sky forgot his name.